This is my final reflection video for the African Portfolio Project, and I asked the question, how do differences between people affect the way that stories of people are shaped and told in history? At first, when I started this, I was just trying to maintain a wide scope of the historical events that took place and draw similarities between them. But throughout this process of drawing together and relating these points of evidence, one clear question kind of came to my mind. How come none of this information was more widespread? I would like to consider myself a pretty passionate person, and I believe that no one should be overlooked, especially not people who have faced generations of trauma. And for my entire life, I've only heard minimal stories about the horrors that have taken place in Africa. And I feel personally like understanding these events and atrocities that are committed by our own countries should be the least that we can do to help prevent similar events from taking place in the future. So I asked, why do these lies get spread, and when do they become so widely accepted? Both using evidence from paper and prior knowledge, I managed to piece together the most complete reason for my question. The first thing that I knew coming into this unit was something that I've elaborated on during other projects in the past, the idea that in societies, money is one of the main factors that controls everything. And I began noticing common themes among the evidence that was presented. A good example of this is the document written by Roger Casement about the horrors committed in the Congo Free State. And the first thing that I took note of in this was that he wrote the document on the orders from the British government. So the crimes that the British government was committing in Africa would be less likely to come into light. Another thing that I took note of was the reasons that America claimed to murder Patrice Lumumba versus what he actually said in his speech that we read, which aligned in essentially no shape or form and were most certainly affected by racist ideals and other ulterior motives for economic gain. And because of this knowledge and of other direct results of the act first world countries committed, it became clear to me that the predominantly white countries no longer had the excuse of their civilizing mission and racism to hold above the African continent, so they had to resort to things such as assassination of foreign leaders and cover-ups of political outrage to maintain their control. These economically and racially motivated acts that were committed by first world countries still affect African countries to this day. Because of the desire for power, wealth, and control over others and the effects of racism, which were still prominent in the leadership of most, if not all, countries, these governments turned towards the exploitation of African people in order to gain cheap products and thus economic welfare. As a result, modern-day Africa is riddled with poverty, multi-generational trauma, and a dependency on the consumer needs in the United States and other places. Another result of this is the stereotypes and the biases that are present today around the world. I think one thing that I learned during this project was how little we are taught about the events that don't directly relate to our own country. And I think that we should be learning about these, because it's important to learn about the experiences of other people so that we can become more understanding and well-rounded individuals. And I also learned a lot about how to draw connections between different parts of history to create evidence and to try and piece together a full narrative. I think that a lot of the things that I learned in this project are not necessarily present in the annotations that I made. And I often tend to piece together ideas and structures in my head, which I personally find more beneficial than putting them solely on paper. On the downside to this often tends to make people more confused about my ideating process, which is why I highlighted some of the things that I noticed specifically earlier in the video. One of my biggest takeaways from this unit was I learned that these horrible things that happened actually happened, which I really didn't know much about before. So it was eye-opening to kind of be able to understand these atrocities in more depth and why they happened. And it kind of provided a new understanding for me, even of what like America does and what the American government has done, which is still horrible and affected by racism in modern times. Most of my reflection responses were more focused on that specific week, and my final topic when it really started piecing itself together over the last 10 days or so. My reflection responses mostly focus on what I summed up in that week, and personally I think that more of my useful evidence are scattered throughout my document analyses over things that I didn't put in my document analyses at all. Personally, I think of my reflection responses and like as my brain kind of like sifting through ideas. For example, in my first week reflection, I talk about how all the documents we read so far were written by people who were white, which didn't necessarily present an authentic African perspective. And in my second weekly reflection, I expanded upon the idea, stating that African stories in history have gotten told, and that's not the issue. But the issue is that African stories have gotten skewed or manipulated over time, and that is really what is causing these stereotypes. Usually there is something that's like sort of obvious that I choose, and I dig deeper than most other people do, but I think that my topic specifically is truly the driving force of why such atrocities are committed, and even if it's a little obvious, digging deeper into something that you think you might know everything about makes your understanding of it better and allows for new perspectives that you may have not considered before. That is a glimpse into my process of researching the African continent and understanding how political, economic, and racial factors affected the stories and information told.